Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, SOITS, Certificate Postgraduate Certificate Programs, Postgraduate Certificate in Climate Change, PGCCC, MEV 0 to 4 Climate Change Assessment Tools, Block-1 Vulnerability Assessment, Unit-3 Social Vulnerability, 3.1 Introduction. In this course, we have already studied the concept of vulnerability in detail. We have also discussed that vulnerability has multiple dimensions, i.e. physical, social, economic and institutional dimensions. Over the years, it has been established that vulnerability to climate change has differential impacts across the society and space. It has also been realized that losses are less due to an event or a natural phenomenon and more due to the vulnerability of exposed human population. This realization has brought analysis of social vulnerability into the forefront of any vulnerability analysis. In this unit, we shall exclusively discuss about social vulnerability. However, in the initial section Section 3.2, we will distinguish between physical vulnerability and social vulnerability. In Section 3.3, we will explain broad factors contributing to social vulnerability. In the concluding section, we will describe various methods used by researchers, planners and administrators for measuring social vulnerability. 3.2 Objectives. After studying this unit, you should be able to describe the concept of physical and social vulnerability, explain the factors contributing to social vulnerability, and describe various methods of analyzing social vulnerability. 3.3 Concept of physical and social vulnerability. The term vulnerability connotes different meaning across various disciplines. It has been used by various researchers in the field of climate change, disaster management, poverty assessment, food security, livelihood assessment, etc. However, when it comes to defining vulnerability, it becomes difficult to have consensus amongst the scholars about the exact definition of vulnerability. That is why you would find many definitions of vulnerability according to the context. It has also been expanded from a unidimensional concept to a multidimensional concept. Let us discuss briefly about the evolution of the concept of vulnerability. In simpler terms, vulnerability connotes the idea of being harmed or damaged. Another important differentiation regarding the vulnerability, as highlighted by authors like Chambers in the year 1989 and Watts and Ghole in the year 1993, that it has two faces which can be distinguished as internal and external aspects. The external side represents the stress which any system has been exposed to, whereas the internal aspects reflects its intrinsic capacity for coping and recovering from stresses or a particular hazard. Buckman, 2006, Chambers, 1989, Fussell and Klein, 2006, Watts and Ghole, 1993. While understanding the term vulnerability, one has to understand the two important characteristics of vulnerability. The first feature is of being highly contextual, i.e. factors that can bring a vulnerable situation in one region or household may differ in another region or household. Brooks et al., 2005, Fussell, 2010. The second feature is its being dynamic in nature that leads to change in level or intensity in case of any variation in either of biophysical or socioeconomic conditions in a particular time span. Cutter et al., 2009, Smith and Wonder, 2006. The concept of vulnerability can further be classified into two categories which include physical and social vulnerability. 3.3.1 Physical vulnerability. The term physical vulnerability denotes the vulnerability in terms of physical infrastructure which makes the community vulnerable to any hazard. Mainly the Physical vulnerability takes into the consideration of physical infrastructures which mainly focuses on location of the population and the environment which has certain structures which can prevent the losses during the hazard. For example, population residing near the coastline may be more vulnerable to cyclones than the population residing away from coast. Similarly, the communities residing near the district headquarters in hilly region are lesser vulnerable than those living in remote areas or near some unstable hillocks to disaster like landslide. In arid and semi-arid areas, having water source or structures to harvest rainwater at the farm level reduces the vulnerability of the households from disaster like droughts as compared to farmlands which totally depends upon rainfall. The communities residing in remote location near the coastline may be vulnerable to the flooding and ingression of sea water during tides. Even in flood-prone areas, physical features like elevations and presence of vegetation may enhance or reduce the physical vulnerability. The structural material and the engineering techniques used in construction of buildings, their heights and a proper plan of exit may also reduce the vulnerability of communities residing near the fault line or in earthquake-prone areas. When we discuss about physical vulnerability, we have to look how the communities have access to drinking water, sanitation, medical amenities, motorable roads and proximity to public rescue agencies. Even the density of the existing population also give rises to the physical vulnerability as the occurrence of disaster may cause more harm to the densely populated area. Thus we can conclude that physical vulnerability depends upon certain factors like proximity to the hazard, population density, how remotely the communities are located, design and planning of the physical infrastructure and the building material which may have been used in housing as well as other important structures. Unit-3. 3.3.2 Social vulnerability. The term social vulnerability gives an idea of the internal feature of the vulnerability. It is indicative of the characters of the community that can cast influence on the capacity for preparing, responding and recovering from the hazards and disasters. When we define social vulnerability in simple terms, it can be as the differential capacity of groups and individuals to deal with hazards based on their positions within physical and social worlds, though 1992, or as the inability to take effective measures to ensure against losses, Bogard, 1988. According to Wisner, 2004, it can be defined as the characteristics of a person or group and their situation that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, or recover from the impact of a hazard. When the concept of livelihood is integrated with social vulnerability, we need to look at the definition given by Ager, who refers it as the exposure of groups or individuals to stress as a result of social and environmental change, where stress refers to unexpected changes and disruption to livelihood. Ager, 1999, p. 249. Social vulnerability can be generally observed after the occurrence of any event or hazard when different patterns can be seen across the same populations who have been exposed to the event. This gives an insight as to why certain groups within the community like children, elders, women or marginalized people face hazards more severely than others, though being having a similar exposure. Cutter, et al. 2000, Heinz Center 2000, Cutter and Finch 2003, Warner 2007. There can be several factors which have been discussed in the following sections that may limit the capacities of the communities for speedy recovery from the impacts of the event, thus aggravating their social vulnerable situations. This leads to a Conclusion that the nature of social vulnerability is pre-existing condition or an inherent property of the communities that may not depend upon the nature of the natural hazard. 3.4 Factors contributing to social vulnerability. Till now, you might have realized that it is very difficult to accurately measure the level of social vulnerability of communities, as many factors may produce a combined effect. The vulnerability can be linked with possession of assets and entitlements. Thus, the communities that are having lesser assets may be more vulnerable than those commanding more for facing the crises like droughts and famine. Moser, 1998. The factors that influence the social vulnerability can be broadly classified into following major four groups. 3.4.1 Social factors. Social factors are the important factors which contribute in enhancing or reducing the social vulnerability. It is well-known fact that if the social status is high, access to the resources will be more, thus providing the group more resilience towards the hazard or event. It also gives the capacity to recover more speedily from the impact of the event. All communities having high social status have less social vulnerability as compared to low social status groups. In India, communities belonging to socially marginalized section have lesser access to resources and hence they are more vulnerable. Another factor under social category is gender. Women have more likelihood to be vulnerable as compared their male counterparts because they have additional responsibilities of family and children. In many cases, they help the household for earning the livelihood, but still their income may not be visible. Even as workforce, they do not enjoy higher labor market position. Another factor which enhances the social vulnerability is the high-level dependency of the family members on one or few earning members. Higher dependency ratio lowers the resilience of the family structure in case of stress or disruption of income during the hazard. Similarly, if some of the family member requires special attention due to the differentially abled, also enhances the social vulnerability of the family. Association with social groups, self-help groups also enhances the resilience of the family and it reduces the social vulnerability. 3.4.2 Economic factors. Economic status can be considered as one of the most important factors which may influence the social vulnerability. Communities or households having better access to economic resources are found to be more resilient as they can sustain the stress for a longer period of time. In India, households classified as above poverty line (APL) are considered to be more resilient than the below poverty line (BPL) households. The larger number of BPL households enhance the social vulnerability. When we are discussing about the economic factors, the occupational structures need to be understood while analyzing the social vulnerability. If the income is based upon occupations which are linked to natural resources like agriculture, animal husbandry and fisheries, they are more likely to be affected by natural hazards or climate-related hazards. These occupations enhance the social vulnerability of the communities. Similarly, if the community owns the land rather than taking on rent, it gives more resilience. Higher number of landholders in the community reduces the social vulnerability. 3.4.3 Demographical factors. Demography of an area also plays an important role in determining social vulnerability. Rapid growth in population, high population density make the community vulnerable as there would be sharing of resources and the quality may diminish. Similarly, age in family structure also has a role in granting resilience to the family. If higher number of children and aged are dependent, they may decrease the resilience and enhance the social vulnerability. Even their mobility is also restricted during the time of hazard thus enhancing the social vulnerability. Another demographic factor affecting the social vulnerability is the rural-urban divide. Communities residing in rural areas are prone to higher level of social vulnerability due to lesser diversification of their livelihood opportunities, whereas communities residing in urban areas have different set of challenges associated with unplanned urbanization and issues related to evacuations at the time of hazard. 3.4.3 Education and access to technology. The levels of education of the communities provide them better resilience during the time of hazard or disaster. Higher levels of education have a direct linkage with a better job opportunity with an enhanced income level, which can reduce the social vulnerability. The working opportunity available after education may not much depend upon the natural resources and hence are not affected by the climate-related events like droughts. Even the communities involved with occupations related to natural resources. Higher level of education may give them opportunity to take correct and informed decisions, as they may have a better understanding about the events and its consequences. The level of education also provides them access to information through latest information and communication technologies, ICT, which may give better resilience and diminish the social vulnerability as compared to communities having lower level of educational attainments. 3.5 Social vulnerability analysis. Till now, we have discussed about the concept of vulnerability in general and social vulnerability in specific. We have also distinguished between physical and social vulnerability. In the previous section, we discussed about the factors affecting social vulnerability. In this section, we will discuss about various ways of assessing social vulnerability. You might have also realized till now that it is one of the challenging tasks to analyze social vulnerability directly. This is because it involves multiple factors and, moreover, there exists an interrelationship between these factors. One of the popular method for analyzing social vulnerability is the index method, where certain broad indicators and proxies are selected to construct an index for comparing the inter- and intra-level of social vulnerability within the community. Here, it is worth to mention about the Social Vulnerability Index, SOVI, developed by Cutter et al. In 2003. Being a multidimensional and scale-dependent index, it could be applied across the spatial units for assessing relative socioeconomic and demographic characters to measure the social vulnerability. Another distinction of this index was that it acted like an indicator giving support to the theoretical premise that the social vulnerability is independent of the type of the hazard. The United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, published a report titled Social Vulnerability Assessment Tools for Climate Change and DRR Programming, 2017, which has suggested tools for analyzing the social vulnerability. CATIC, 2017. The flowchart for the activities in assessment process is being depicted in Figure 3.1. Thus, we can see that index method is the most popular method. However, there are certain other methods which are being discussed in the following section. 3.5.1 Community-based method. The community-based method gives the central importance to the inputs given by the communities and households or groups who have undergone and overcome the hazard or the event, thus integrating the experiences gained by the community. This method is useful as in most of the cases, the assessments are generally carried out by outsiders or experts who generally miss the authentic inputs from local people. Thus, involvement of the community will improve the efficiency of the assessment process and can be more relevant for them who are directly exposed to the risk in that particular area and may act as an input for adaptation strategies. Another advantage of this method is that effective involvement of the community raises their awareness towards the potential risk and motivate them for taking appropriate coping mechanism. The method involves various steps. The first step is to form a team for vulnerability assessment from the representatives of the community. Data from such groups have been collected by employing tools like questionnaire, interviews, cognitive mappings, and other field participatory process for identifying threats and about population which may be socially and physically vulnerable. The next step involved is integration of inputs from the community for creating accessible and easily understandable vulnerability identification to the contextual threat to the community, so that appropriate strategy could be planned both at local level and can also be incorporated at policy formulation level. One of such community-based method has been proposed by the CARE International, named as Climate Vulnerability and Capacity Analysis, CVCA, that has deep linkages with the community. It was believed that through participation and knowledge sharing from the community, transformation can be brought. In this analysis, importance was given to context-specific investigations along with enhanced dialogues with the communities both at regional and national levels. Besides, the analysis combined the prior existing knowledge of poverty and vulnerability with the disaster risks reduction (DRR). The CVCA has been useful in vulnerability assessment across various scales. Days et al. 2009. 3.5.2 Census and other existing secondary data. The census data and other secondary source data are generally authentic data which are provided by the government or state agencies. The census data provides various demographical parameters such as area-wise total population, male and female population, sex ratio, educational attainments, children, 0 to 6 years, literacy, and occupational status like agricultural workers, cultivators, non-workers and workforce in households industries. Various indicators and proxies like sex ratio, dependency ratio, percentage of marginalized communities, occupational profile, and rural-urban ratio can be drawn from these available data that can be used in the construction of Social Vulnerability Index. In India, the census gives a district handbook for each district which contains micro-level both census and non-census data from village level to community block development level to district level, which can be used for several demographical and socio-economic characteristics of the communities while analyzing the social vulnerability at micro level. Census 2011. Even the census data can be used for supporting the primary field data while evaluating the social vulnerability. When you have to analyze social vulnerability in reference to the climate change or climate-related hazard, then you may require meteorological data such as rainfall, temperature, humidity, sunshine, etc., which can be obtained from the State Meteorological Department. In India, the India Meteorological Department, IMD, Pune provides the authentic data for research purpose. These data can be used for calculating the change in pattern of rainfall and temperature, especially when analyzing the vulnerability in context to climate change. Similarly, there are other secondary data sources which can provide various socioeconomic parameters of an area. These include below poverty line (BPL), census, district outlines issued by Government Department of Economics and Statistics, disaster management plan, report of Central Groundwater Board, national and state action plans for climate change, national communication to United Nations, NATCOM, reports of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Human Development Reports, UNDP, and other national as well as international publications can be used for supporting the primary data for analysis of social vulnerability. 3.5.3 contextual analysis of image and GIS data, the geographical information system and remote sensing data information have added another dimension in vulnerability analysis. The information and images can now be integrated with other models as well as approaches for assessing social vulnerability across the spatial units and has also been a useful tool to determine the pre- and post-damages after the event. In one of the pilot projects regarding the use of remote sensing and GIS data in social vulnerability analysis has been discussed by Buckman and Wisner, 2006 in their book Measuring the Unmeasurable, The Challenge of Vulnerability. They have highlighted the role and importance of the remote sensing in mapping the vulnerable population for the disaster tsunami in Sri Lanka. The mapping was done by German Aerospace Center and UNUEHs using rapid and multi-dimension vulnerability assessment. The analysis was based on the premise that vulnerability was linked with certain infrastructure and housing structure as well as their proximity with the sea as well as the earthquake hotspots. If these images were captured through satellite, it could be compared with the ground-level data for checking the reliability. The satellite and GIS data was used to classify the zones thematically, analyze the housing structures and settlements, and was used to compute the pre- and post-hazard scenario in combination with other vulnerability proxies. The overall analysis depicted that remote sensing could be of great help for assessing the impacts in terms of physical dimensions and losses, Buckman and Wisner. 2006. Similarly, flood vulnerability has also been analyzed by using GIS data by various researchers across the globe. In China, the vulnerability to flood hazard has been examined, Gao et al. 2007, with the help of GIS in Dongting Lake region. The GIS data have been combined with analytical hierarchy techniques that was used for assigning weights to indicators that have significant impact on flood bearers, Gao et al., 2007. Similarly, the vulnerability analysis for floodplains have been done in Ondo town of Nigeria using the remote sensing and GIS images for generating digital elevation model, DEM, and maps like slope map and risk analysis map by Oinloe and Olamizu in year 2011. The authors were of the opinion that images from these technologies can be very helpful in decision-making with a strategy to reduce vulnerability in floodplains across the globe. They used the open-source spot image which was processed through GIS, which was very useful in designing the maps and the digital elevation model. Oinloe Olamiju, 2011. A framework was developed by Slafstein and Ster in 2007, wherein the researchers have used GIS tool for generating the combined single coastal vulnerability index for analyzing the coastal natural hazards in northeast Brazil. The researchers identified 16 variables which have been used to generate maps for natural vulnerability, socioeconomic vulnerability, and total vulnerability. The composite scores were used for analyzing the level of disparity in vulnerability between community and regions that were exposed to natural hazards. Slafstein and Ster, 2007. In another study, the coastal vulnerability to climate change was assessed by Torreson et al. In 2012 for Italy, where they have combined the GIS data with DEVA model for analysis suggesting various adaptation strategies with an aim to develop GIS decision support system for coastal zones, Torreson et al., 2012. Similarly, in India, the coastal vulnerability of Odisha coast for tropical cyclones have been analyzed by Sahu Bhaskaran in year 2017. Where the researchers have estimated the composite coastal vulnerability integrating physical, social, economical, and environmental vulnerability. The results have been stacked using GIS tool to generate the integrated scenario of vulnerability for the entire coastline of Odisha, Sahu and Bhaskaran, 2017. The high-resolution image has been used to generate proxy variables by Ebert Stein in the year 2009 for measuring social vulnerability in Honduras. The data obtained was combined with elevation and hazard data along with socioeconomic parameters of the households. The arrived social vulnerability index was combined with GIS data. The researchers concluded that GIS data can be a very useful tool if it is combined with contextual traditional field-level data, and the results can have a wider coverage with in-depth analysis along with cost efficiency, especially in study areas where the data availability is limited. Ebert Stein, 2009. Thus we can conclude that the data of remote sensing and GIS tools can be very helpful in depicting the visual maps of social vulnerability. The traditional survey method for identifying various indicators and proxies can give more accurate results if it is combined with images and GIS data in the context of the area where the analysis is being conducted. 3.6 Summary: vulnerability is the outcome of combined effects of three components. The three components are exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Physical vulnerability denotes the vulnerability in terms of physical infrastructure, which makes the community vulnerable to any hazard, whereas social vulnerability refers to the differential capacity of groups and individuals to deal with hazards based on their positions within physical and social worlds. Factors influencing the social vulnerability can be broadly classified into major four groups: social, economic, demographic, and education, and access to technology. There are three extensively used methods for social vulnerability analysis. These three methods are community-based method, census, and other existing. Secondary data and contextual analysis of image and GIS data. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.